My name is Olayinka Olagbegi Adegbite. I am the outreach coordinator and a soon-to-be interim assistant director of the African Studies program here at UW-Madison. And I have the honor of introducing our speaker for today, last but not least speaker for today. Dr. Catherine Mehra is an Albert Markham postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of African Cultural Studies here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she got a PhD. In her research, Dr. Mehra employs ethnography and critical discourse analysis to explore discourse and cultural practices surrounding genocide. In her dissertation, Rwandan Diasporic Discourse in Toronto, talking about and commemorating the 1994 genocide. This study examined commemorative and discursive practices, attitudes, and processes of socialization among people of Rwanda heritage living outside of Rwanda, including those born in Rwanda and in the diaspora. Through ethnography and critical discourse analysis, Dr. Mehra examined how Rwanda talked about the genocide in simultaneously similar and different ways, and how they learn and teach each other, as well as others, about how to represent genocide appropriately and assign meaning to their commemorative practices. Dr. Mehra is the author of The Remains of Humanity, an auto-ethnographic account of a misery tourist in Rwanda. In this article, she examined the presentations of human remains at memorial commemorating the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. Today, Dr. Mehra will be talking to us about, taking us through our experiences conducting research among the Rwanda community of Toronto, and how the lessons she learned about the power of language in representing genocide translates to the K-12 classroom. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Catherine Mehra. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olayinka, for that very generous introduction, and to the workshop's organizers for inviting me to join you. I'm honored to be here, and I'm so heartened to see so many K-12 educators committed to teaching their students about genocide and other mass atrocities. So I'll just share my screen. Whoop. Okay. Okay. So as Olayinka mentioned, I do research among Rwandan communities in Toronto. In particular, I examine how Rwandans living outside of Rwanda talk about and commemorate the 1994 genocide. Before getting too far into my presentation, I'd like to give a very brief background for those who are unable to look at the resources I sent beforehand. Although the people whose descendants who would become known as Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa settled the region of Rwanda and together formed a highly centralized kingdom with a shared language and culture, it was a state with some serious inequalities. Historian and human rights activist Alison Desforage explains that the word Tutsi, which apparently first described the status of an individual, a person rich in cattle, became the term that referred to the elite group as a whole. And the word Hutu, meaning originally a subordinate or follower of a more powerful person, came to refer to the mass of the ordinary people. However, prior to colonization, these identities were flexible and informal. For example, it was possible for a Hutu person to be adopted into a Tutsi lineage, and furthermore, not all Tutsi individuals were members of the political elite. The majority occupied similar roles to Hutu, that of cultivators. The meaning and flexibility of these terms would change under colonization. Both Tutsi and Belgian power holders benefited from a system of dual colonialism, in which the creation of an ethnic-centered paradigm made being Tutsi sufficient basis for claiming power, and in turn enabled Tutsi individuals to help implement colonial policies, thus making Rwanda easier to govern for the Belgians. Belgian colonial officials, in collaboration with Rwandan power holders, sought to solidify the status of Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa individuals, and in effect, racialize what were once socioeconomic identities. In the years preceding independence in 1962, various political parties developed, seemingly split along ethnic lines. For Rwandans who did not receive formal education, this divide did not correspond to their experiences, for they believed that what they had experienced was the result of colonial oppression, not ultimate origins. For them, it was the simple exercise of power that created and reinforced the hierarchies of social superiority. In other words, for many who believe that colonialism created a division between Hutu and Tutsi individuals, the fight for Rwandan independence was not understood in terms of power, rather than existential hatred between Hutu and Tutsi people. Violence occurring before and after Rwanda's transition to independence, spanning until the 1970s, has since been framed as ethnic. However, it often resembled Hutu power holders capitalizing on a number of events to incite violence against Tutsi people, including attacks on the country by Tutsi refugees from neighboring countries, dismal economic conditions, and the selective genocide carried out by neighboring Burundi's Tutsi-led army against the country's Hutu population. Although such ethnically framed violence eventually tapered off, many Hutu individuals were killed, and even more were forced to flee the country. In the years immediately preceding the 1994 genocide, a number of events again fundamentally shifted the manner in which ethnicity was deployed in Rwanda, including economic decline, the allowance of multiple political parties for the first time in decades, an ongoing civil war with the Rwandan Patriotic Front, a political party composed of Tutsi refugees and their children wishing to return, ethnically framed violence in neighboring Burundi, and what is largely considered the most immediate catalyst of the genocide, the downing of the Rwandan president's plane on April 6, 1994. Political scientist Scott Strauss points to the major developments prior to the beginning of the genocide, including but not limited to Hutu hardliners' conflation of the RPF and Tutsi civilians, who were in many cases seen as accomplices of those foreign invaders, the composition of death lists, including the names of RPF supporters and Hutu opponents, the distribution of anti-Tutsi propaganda, consisting of fear-mongering along with ethnic nationalism and stereotypes that saw Tutsi people reduced to foreign invaders, Inyenzi, cockroaches, and Inzoka, snakes, and the development of an extremist political alliance that excluded Tutsi and came to be known as Hutu power. During the genocide itself, some of the first targets were actually moderate Hutu leaders, and journalists, human rights activists, and anyone, Hutu or Tutsi, not firmly in the extremists' camp. Then Tutsi and anyone who looked Tutsi were targeted. While the RPF eventually gained control of Rwanda in July 1994, from the beginning of the genocide until its end, over 500,000 Tutsi and approximately 50,000 Hutu people were killed. Although not to the scale or of the same nature as the genocide against the Tutsi, the RPF killed Hutu civilians in their effort to win Rwanda. Since 1994, the RPF has been the ruling party in Rwanda. Since the genocide's end, the RPF government has implemented legislation and forms of commemoration that enforce a particular way of talking about and representing the genocide. And this is where my research comes in. I am interested in how the Rwandan government's discourse about the genocide is extended, repeated, used, or not outside of the country. I examine how Rwandans talk about the genocide in simultaneously similar and different ways, learn and teach both each other and others how to represent it appropriately, and assign meaning to their commemorative practices. I suggest that Rwandan discourse about the genocide not only aims to represent their interests as individuals, but also as members of imagined communities. Rwandans frequently position their stories in relation to other narratives about the 1994 genocide, and they are further invested in socializing others, particularly those who were not in Rwanda during the genocide, into telling similar narratives. Through commemoration, conversation, and advocacy for genocide legislation in their new communities. Now, during the Q&A, I would be happy to address questions about the 1994 genocide in Rwanda or my research specifically, since I understand that was a very short presentation of both. But for the rest of my presentation, I'd like to tell a few stories from my fieldwork and my research, and then expound upon how the lessons I learned and how they might be relevant in your classrooms. At its core, my research is about representation, how the 1994 genocide is discussed, commemorated, ultimately represented, which I believe has direct bearing on what you all do teaching about genocide. So for instance, one of the things I came to focus on is what particular term or phrase those I spoke to prefer to use when talking about the genocide. Although in the United States, the term the Rwandan genocide has become very commonplace, the Rwandan government has advocated for a different term. That is the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. It's a fairly recentish development in the early 2000s. This phrase has actually been formally recognized by the United Nations and other international governments, including the Canadian one. In my research, though, I was interested in learning how my interlocutors referred to the genocide. So one particularly fraught area when constructing my interview questions was how to refer to the genocide itself without inadvertently influencing their word choice. On the one hand, I did not want to offend my future interlocutors by using an incorrect term, for example, the Rwandan genocide, but I also did not want to taint the interview by prematurely applying a term that I thought they might use, for instance, the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. My anxieties about proper language use were initially informed by my experience in Rwanda the previous summer. I had accidentally said the Rwandan genocide to an employee at the Kigali Genocide Memorial. And she swiftly corrected me and told me to refer to it as the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. She explained that the term Rwandan genocide is offensive to many Rwandans because it implies that all Rwandans were involved in the violence. In other words, involved as perpetrators. This slippage was unintentional on my part, for I was already aware of the Rwandan government's campaign for international recognition of the latter term, but I had grown accustomed to using Rwandan genocide because it is what most Americans recognize and use when talking about it. As a compromise, when writing my own interview questions, my advisor suggested using a neutral phrase in my initial question, the events of 1994 in Rwanda, with the intention of substituting whatever word or phrase the interviewee prefers in later questions. During my first interview, though, my interlocutor took issue with my attempt at neutral phrasing and told me to say genocide against the Tutsi. She went on to say that my chosen phrase, in effect, minimized the genocide. Of course, I apologized and took up her phrase over the course of our interview. Although made very nervous by my initial meeting, I continued to ask those I spoke to how they referred to the events of 1994 in Rwanda, and I received very diverse responses, including many terms in Kinyarwanda, the language of Rwanda, such as itsemba tsemba, that is a mass extermination, or itsemba, Itsembabwako, which Itsembe is extermination, Itsembabwako is mass extermination, which is how the genocide was referred to in the years immediately following the genocide. When asked why she used 1994 genocide against the Tutsi instead of the term she preferred, Itsemba, one of my interlocutors said, because that's what we use. Although she uses a particular phrase, because that is what those around her are using, that she and others prefer other terms suggests that even the accepted phrase is contested to a certain degree. To give a more widely known example, I'll briefly talk about the term the Holocaust. Although the term Holocaust is now commonly understood as a referent for the genocide committed in Nazi Germany, its recognition was not immediate following the end of World War II. Before the genocide, the lowercase Holocaust had a long history of its own. It is derived from the Greek word meaning completely burnt, sacrificial offering, which is offered in Greek versions of the Torah as a translation of the Hebrew term Ola. Coincidentally, the first known instance of the term Holocaust being used in connection to Nazi Germany was not to describe its treatment of the Jewish population, but rather a mass burning of banned books in May 1933. By the early 20th century, however, the term had gradually taken on the secondary and more secular meaning of massacre. During the Holocaust, and even in the decades following it, there was not a singular term to describe it, with the exception of perhaps the Nazis' own phrase, final solution, which risks inadvertently repeating Nazi terminology. Rather, a number of terms and phrases cropped up, including those that paired with the term Holocaust as a descriptor. For instance, Jewish Holocaust, Nazi Holocaust. There is some disagreement as to when precisely the Holocaust as a proper noun came to prominence. However, scholars have identified a few potential catalysts, including the translation of Israel's Declaration of Independence, which mentions the Nazi Holocaust, as well as media coverage of the trial of Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann over the course of 1961. But many credit the 1978 miniseries Holocaust, starring Meryl Streep, with the cementation of the Holocaust as a standalone word. And in 1979, the Association for the German Language selected it as its word of the year in order to recognize increased public awareness of the term. Despite current widespread recognition of the term Holocaust, it is by no means uncontested nor free of controversy. Even now, nearly 75 years later, due to its religious and sacrificial connotation, Holocaust is rejected by some Jewish people in favor of the Hebrew term Shoah, in other words, calamity or catastrophe. But words like Shoah and final solution refer specifically to the genocide committed against the European Jewish population, not other victims of Nazi crimes against humanity, such as the Roma, disabled people, or gay people. Discourse around some of these mass murders have produced their own particular terms. For instance, the genocide against the Romani has its own term. The Holocaust has evolved yet again after becoming the Holocaust, big H, with more contemporary connotations, conflating it with genocide. For instance, the Rwandan Holocaust. So what does this have to do with you? Am I telling you how to call the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, to stop using the word Holocaust? No, definitely not. What I am trying to bring your attention to, however, is that there are numerous ways to refer to every genocide, and some people may prefer one way to another. In other words, no singular way will likely satisfy everyone, no matter how commonplace it is within your community, or even on the world stage at large. Language is human-made and therefore imperfect, complicated, and influenced by a host of factors, including political ones. So what can you do with this? First and foremost, in your classrooms, you can bring attention to this in your teaching. It doesn't have to be a long, drawn-out lesson, but you can tell your students we're referring to the Rwandan Genocide, or we may know it by the Rwandan Genocide, but some survivors prefer 1994 Genocide Against the Tutsi. You may use multiple phrases synonymously and simultaneously throughout your lesson, or instead of trying to find one word or another to encapsulate a rather large and complicated event, you can try to find a way to succinctly describe, which is perhaps why I am most comfortable with the phrase 1994 genocide in Rwanda. Maybe two, if you are able. For instance, if you have the honor of hosting and introducing a guest survivor speaker, you can ask them how they would prefer you refer to the genocide at the event in their honor. A second lesson regarding assumptions, but a little background first. In the years following the genocide, the Rwandan government imposed policies of national unity and reconciliation to promote unity between Tutsi and Hutu in creating one Rwanda for all Rwandans. There are a number of initiatives pertinent to this, but the most important for our purposes is the criminalization of references to ethnic identity in Rwanda. In Rwanda, outside of the context of genocide commemoration, Rwandans are not to identify themselves or others as Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa, but rather as Rwandan. At the same time, however, there is an increasing effort to narrowly define who precisely are the victims of the genocide, whereas before there was an acknowledgement of Hutu victims, often termed moderate Hutu. Now, as I've mentioned, the phrase 1994 genocide against the Tutsi is gaining traction. So now to my story and perhaps one of my blunders. Over the course of many conversations, I found that those I spoke to, although aware of Rwandan legislation, would often use terms of ethnic identity, definitely when talking about historical events, but also in some cases, even when referring to themselves and others in the present day. For example, one person recounted meeting a Hutu individual at a conference, or who they thought was a Hutu person. Another said they have a lot of Hutu friends. Now, on to me. While writing up my research, I shared initial drafts of my chapters with a writing group composed of my advisor and a number of her other students. On numerous occasions, I received similar feedback from one colleague who would observe that I only interviewed people on one side. Initially, I conceded his point. I explained that those I spoke to were the people I had access to through a Rwandan community organization. And given that what I heard from my interlocutors at the time, I speculated that Rwandans of Hutu background might not take part in the community organization. However, my omission of an openly Hutu perspective became such a problem that eventually I was advised to ask my past interlocutors who implied that they knew Hutu people if they could put me in touch with any. When I contacted my past interlocutors, I tried to avoid offense as much as I could, given what I knew about ethnic identity at the time. And so I tried to use the phrases that they used, and no one seemed terribly offended by my asking. One request, however, led to an interesting revelation about how I misidentify those I encounter in my research community. One person I asked immediately had someone in mind, but he wanted my advice on how to approach her. He explained that she was actively involved in their community organization. However, as she had previously explained to him, other members of the organization were hesitant or distrustful around her because they identified her as Hutu. I expressed my interest in meeting her, insisting that I wouldn't ask her explicitly about her ethnicity, and we agreed that he would ask her to talk about the organization with me. My interlocutor mentioned his friend's name in passing, and I recognized it as belonging to someone I had already interviewed, but based on what he had told me and what I remembered of my interview with her, I assumed it was a different person with the same name. However, when we reached out to me after contacting her, he said that she claimed that she had already spoken with me. He asked, "Don't you remember?" Embarrassed, I said, "Of course I do." I subsequently abandoned my initiative to intentionally recruit Hutu interlocutors. At the time, I questioned if I had similarly identified other participants differently than they would have identified themselves to me. Based on how I read certain signs and what they were telling me. While acknowledging that identification is a naturally occurring process, I was and am disappointed in myself for assuming someone's ethnic identification to begin with. So again, what does this have to do with you? Prior to the workshop, Mary sent over some questions you wanted addressed. And so one such question was how to address or deal with teaching about genocide when one of your students might have experienced a similar situation or are descended from genocide survivors themselves. I don't think there's any one way to handle this situation, but what I can try to caution you is not to make assumptions about their background or what they do or do not want to share, either in the classroom, in conversation, or even in written assignments. 2, try not to ask invasive questions, such as, are you a Hutu or are you a Tutsi? In my own teaching, I make very clear from the beginning what we will be studying and when, so there are no surprises and students can excuse or prepare themselves as necessary. 2, I embed activities and assignments that allow all students to reflect, all students at least the option to reflect on their own lives and experiences alongside the course readings. Whether that be a visit to a museum, a conversation with a grandparent, or an experience with racism. I give this option to all students so no one feels singled out, but that everyone therefore is emboldened to talk about what they'd like or not talk about what they wouldn't like to. Now on to the third and final lesson, how to handle trauma. Many of you asked about how to teach students about genocide and other human rights violations without essentially traumatizing them, which I mean is a valid concern. Over the course of my research, both in Rwanda and in Canada, I witnessed various ways in which people respond to and process their grief. From formal commemoration to memorials, writing memoirs, stories and songs, crafting art, advocating for various legislation, recognizing the 1994 genocide, all the way to avoiding talking about it at all. One really meaningful event I attended during my fieldwork was an event sponsored by Rwandan Youth in Canada, Our Past. Although the event was the first of its kind in Canada, it's my understanding that it's been a major event in Rwanda for numerous years. At the event, numerous poems were read, personal experiences shared, and songs sung. I bring attention to this event and other forms of commemoration in order to underscore that you can and should teach about genocide in numerous ways in order to reach your various students. Whereas one student may be touched or invested in learning more simply by reading a history book, that may be too detached for another. Maybe they would benefit, they would connect better with what you're telling them by listening to survivor testimony, reading a memoir, either in whole or an excerpt from it, watching a film or reading a fictional account. Diversify your presentation as much as you are able. If you would like more sources on Rwanda, please feel free to reach out to me personally. I included my email at the beginning of the presentation, but if you missed it, I've also included it on the final slide, and I can also send it out via the chat. Regarding how to respond to students' potential trauma, I think the source of their feelings might vary. Perhaps listening to accounts of one genocide or another makes them feel there's no good in the world. Even if you don't have time to address these sources explicitly in class, have some accounts of helpers or rescuers on hand. I have a few sources that I'll include in the chat that I can share with you. And if you'd like to contact me later, I can provide the name of some firsthand accounts if you'd like. On the other hand, maybe some students will feel helpless because they feel like there's nothing they can do to prevent such mass atrocities from occurring again. If you are willing and able, brainstorm with them purposeful things they can do, spreading awareness, hosting fundraisers, looking at career tracks aimed at genocide prevention, looking at the various causes of genocide and mass violence, and thinking about initiatives they can take now, whatever that might be, and whatever is possible in your circumstances. Just as a point too, and this is in closing, I think there's nothing wrong with teaching uncomfortable lessons. Talking about genocide is vital and important, and yes, a little uncomfortable sometimes. Essentially confronting the worst humanity has to offer. To a certain extent, though, I think we have to grow comfortable being uncomfortable and uncomfortable being comfortable. Particularly when talking about genocide, reassure your students that it's okay to be uncomfortable sometimes. And in fact, maybe you'd be concerned if genocide didn't make them a little squeamish. It's okay not to understand entirely. It's okay to be wrong sometimes. It's okay to admit that you just don't know. To assume that a particular experience is fully knowable without having experienced it would be a false claim. And if we as simultaneous teachers and students ever grow too complacent or too sure of the facts or ways of knowing, it's likely we've missed one or two facts ourselves. It's likely we don't understand as well as we thought we did. So as I promised, it was in closing. So again, here's my email address, kmmara@wisc.edu. Please feel free to get in touch with me. And in the meantime, I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.